Germany, early 1934. Snow lingered along the curbs of Berlin as torchlight parades cut through the winter dark, banners snapping beneath the red glow of swastikas. Just 1 year after Adolf Hitler had been appointed chancellor, the regime proclaimed triumph, a revolution achieved without civil war, a nation reborn without the chaos that had scarred the Weimar years. To foreign observers, it seemed almost miraculous, order restored, unemployment falling, confidence rising. But beneath the spectacle, behind the synchronized cheers and orchestrated pageantry, something far more permanent was being built, and few yet understood how completely Germany was about to change. The transformation began not with tanks in the streets, but with a law. On January 30th, 1934, exactly 1 year after Hitler entered office, the government passed the law for the reconstruction of the Reich. It sounded administrative, almost dull. In reality, it marked the destruction of German federalism. The state parliaments, once sovereign voices within a federal system, were dissolved. Their powers flowed upward, absorbed into Berlin. The Länder became hollow administrative shells. The old constitutional architecture collapsed quietly, replaced by centralized authority that answered only to the Reich government. Police forces were synchronized, regional autonomy vanished. The process known as Gleichschaltung, coordination, tightened its grip. Local power structures, once diverse and independent, now moved in lockstep. Authority no longer radiated outward from the people. It descended from a single political center. Germany was no longer a federation. It was becoming something new, a centralized racial state whose loyalty was measured not in citizenship, but in ideology. And yet, internationally, Hitler appeared measured, even restrained. Just 4 days before the Reconstruction law, on January 26th, Germany signed a 10-year non-aggression pact with Poland. Europe blinked in surprise. The agreement disrupted France's Eastern Alliance system and soothed fears of immediate conflict. Diplomats in London and Paris debated whether Hitler had moderated. Was this proof that Germany sought stability rather than expansion? Or was it something else entirely? A strategic pause designed to buy time while rearmament advanced quietly out of sight? Abroad, crises competed for attention. Austria teetered toward civil conflict. France wrestled with scandal. Across the Atlantic, the United States labored through currency reform under Franklin D. Roosevelt. Compared to these upheavals, Germany seemed disciplined, focused, even calm. Foreign correspondents reported falling unemployment figures, from over 6 million to just above 3 million. Recovery, it appeared, was underway, but statistics can conceal as much as they reveal. Behind the numbers, manipulation thrived. Women were removed from official counts. Young men were absorbed into labor services. Political opponents were excluded from registration. The illusion of economic resurgence masked wage freezes, consumer shortages, and a looming foreign currency crisis. Shops carried fewer imported goods. Workers whispered about stagnant pay. The celebration felt real, but increasingly, so did the unease. If you value deep, carefully researched storytelling that reveals how power truly shifts beneath the surface, take a moment to subscribe and like. It helps this work reach others who want history told not as myth, but as living reality. Meanwhile, the revolution that had promised sweeping transformation began turning inward. The brown-shirted stormtroopers of the Sturmabteilung, the SA, had marched, fought, and bled for this new Germany. Nearly 4 million strong by early 1934, they believed they were the revolution's engine. Their leader, Ernst Röhm, envisioned a people's army, the absorption of the traditional Reichswehr into a mass militia loyal to Nazi ideals rather than aristocratic officers. The old Prussian elite, he argued, must yield to the revolutionary will, but Hitler saw the future differently. On February 28, 1934, inside the War Ministry, he convened a critical meeting with leaders of the SA, the SS, and the Reichswehr. There, he made his position unmistakably clear. The Reichswehr would remain Germany's sole armed force. No merger, no people's militia, the professional army, conservative, disciplined, and deeply suspicious of the SA, would be preserved. The declaration stunned Röhm. An agreement was signed reducing the SA to political duties and pre-military training. To the stormtroopers who believed they had delivered the revolution, it felt like betrayal. Murmurs of anger spread through their ranks, morale faltered. The revolutionary base began to sense that power was consolidating, but not in their hands. And as frustration simmered in beer halls and barracks, another force watched carefully from the shadows. The revolution was no longer expanding outward, it was preparing to devour its own. By the spring of 1934, the greatest danger to Adolf Hitler did not lie across Germany's borders. It stood in brown uniforms inside his own movement, for millions strong, loud with expectation, and increasingly restless. The Sturmabteilung, the SA, had marched through the chaos of the Weimar years believing they were the vanguard of a social revolution. Now, as the state hardened into something disciplined and centralized, they began to sense that the revolution they fought for was slipping from their grasp, and they did not intend to accept that quietly. Ernst Röhm, the SA's blunt, battle-hardened chief, was no mere subordinate. He had known Hitler since the early days of Munich beer halls and street fights. Loyal, fearless, and unapologetically radical, Röhm believed the Nazi seizure of power was only phase 1. Phase 2, in his mind, meant dismantling the old elite, breaking the aristocratic officer corps, redistributing influence, and fusing the Reichswehr into a vast people's army loyal not to tradition, but to ideology. To Röhm and his stormtroopers, the revolution had not yet truly begun, but Hitler had already made his calculation. Germany's professional army, the Reichswehr, though limited by the Treaty of Versailles, retained prestige, discipline, and the loyalty of conservative elites. Industrial magnates and financiers, whose cooperation Hitler needed for rearmament and economic stabilization, trusted the army. They did not trust the SA's revolutionary rhetoric. To secure long-term power, Hitler required the confidence of generals and businessmen, not the chaos of perpetual street revolution. On February 28th, at the War Ministry in Berlin, the confrontation crystallized. Hitler summoned leaders of the SA, the SS, and the Reichswehr into a single room thick with tension. There, before assembled commanders, he declared unequivocally the Reichswehr would remain Germany's sole armed force. The SA would not absorb it, the army would not be replaced. The revolution would stop at the barracks gate. Röhm sat rigid, absorbing the humiliation. An agreement was signed reducing the SA to political education and pre-military training roles. It was a public demotion, a quiet stripping of ambition. To the stormtroopers who had terrorized opponents and filled prisons, it felt like abandonment, and beneath their disciplined salutes, resentment began to harden into something more dangerous. The anger did not explode immediately. It simmered as men complained openly in taverns. They mocked the conservative officer corps. They whispered that Hitler had grown cautious, that he was bowing to industrialists and aristocrats. The revolutionary base felt betrayed. The promise of sweeping social transformation, land reform, economic upheaval, the destruction of privilege, had been quietly shelved. Meanwhile, another organization observed with calculated patience. Under the leadership of Heinrich Himmler and his methodical deputy Reinhard Heydrich, the SS began compiling detailed files on Röhm and senior SA figures. Allegations of corruption, moral impropriety, disloyal conversations, everything was documented. Every indiscretion became a potential weapon. The dossiers thickened. The evidence, real, exaggerated, or manufactured, accumulated silently. And as the SA's numbers swelled toward 4 million, their size itself became a liability. Foreign diplomats reported concerns about instability. German industrialists worried about investor confidence. The army feared being overshadowed by a politically radical militia. The existence of such a vast paramilitary force outside formal military control was intolerable to conservative power brokers. Behind closed doors, generals began pressing for clarity. Would Hitler restrain the SA, or would he allow revolution to continue devouring Germany's traditional institutions? Their support for future rearmament depended on the answer. The tension was no longer ideological alone, it was existential. If the SA pushed too hard, it risked alienating the very elites whose cooperation Hitler required. But if Hitler moved against Röhm, he would be striking at the loyal comrades who had helped carry him to power. Either path carried peril, either path risked fracture. And as March turned to April, the reports from Himmler and Heydrich grew darker, more urgent, more damning. The files were complete, the army was watching. And Hitler was running out of time. As the struggle with the SA deepened, the state itself was being reforged into something colder, sharper, and far more enduring. While Germany argued about revolution, a parallel transformation unfolded in silence, the construction of a system designed not merely to defeat enemies, but to eliminate them entirely. And by the time most Germans understood what was happening, the machinery would already be beyond their reach. The SS, under the disciplined command of Heinrich Himmler, expanded methodically. Unlike the loud, swaggering SA, the SS cultivated an image of order and ideological purity. It was smaller, more selective, more loyal personally to Adolf Hitler. Its power did not depend on mass rallies or street brawls, it depended on files, intelligence, and control was tightening. The prototype had already been created the previous year, Dachau. Established in 1933, it had initially been presented as a facility for political re-education. By early 1934, the Dachau model was being systematized. Administrative procedures were standardized, guard units were professionalized. What began as improvised detention centers for political opponents evolved into a structured network governed by regulation and ideology. The camp was no longer temporary, it was institutional. At the same time, the legal system itself was reshaped to serve repression. Special courts were established to bypass traditional judicial safeguards. Charges such as malicious gossip or undermining the morale of the nation could bring swift punishment. Trials were accelerated, appeals diminished. The message was unmistakable. Dissent would not merely be discouraged, it would be criminalized. Law no longer restrained power, it enabled it. Then, the press fell. Daily directives flowed from the propaganda ministry. Editors learned quickly that deviation carried consequences. Independent voices were squeezed between censorship and closure. By March 31st, even a liberal newspaper that had survived for more than 2 centuries ceased publication. Its presses fell silent, not in dramatic protest, but in exhausted compliance. Germany's public conversation narrowed to a single authorized tone. Criticism did not vanish, it retreated into whispers. If you value history told with depth, nuance, and the clarity that reveals how democracies erode step by step, take a moment to subscribe and like. It helps this work reach those who want to understand how systems change and how they can change again. Beneath the surface, discrimination intensified. The regime was cautious about provoking foreign backlash with open brutality, yet bureaucratic exclusion became increasingly sophisticated. Forms, registries, background checks, paperwork itself became a weapon. In Hamburg, a housewife named Louisa lived in quiet dread that her husband's Jewish ancestry would be exposed. Applications were returned for minor inconsistencies. Clarifications were demanded, reapplications were required. Each delay carried implication, each signature felt like a test. The terror was invisible, but it was constant. Economic realities added further strain, official statistics celebrated recovery. Unemployment had dropped dramatically from its catastrophic peak. But the figures were curated, women were removed from labor counts. Young men entered labor service programs. Political opponents disappeared from the rolls. Meanwhile, a foreign currency shortage loomed. Imports tightened, consumer goods grew scarce. Real wages remained frozen. The pageantry of recovery masked a society adjusting to constraint. Public enthusiasm shifted. The jubilant rallies of 1933 gave way to quieter compliance. Citizens adapted. They learned which topics to avoid, which jokes not to tell. which neighbors not to question. Fear did not need to roar, it only needed to exist. And within the regime, the rivalry sharpened. The SA continued to agitate for a second revolution. Its leadership spoke openly of unfinished business. The Reichswehr demanded stability and discipline. Industrialists wanted predictability. Foreign governments watched cautiously for signs of chaos. The SS, increasingly empowered, expanded its intelligence networks, documenting conversations, tracking loyalties, assessing threats. The state had conquered its federal structure. It had neutralized opposition parties. It had strangled independent media. It had constructed detention centers and special courts. Now it faced its final internal question. Could a revolutionary movement survive once it achieved power? Or would it have to destroy part of itself to endure? The dossiers on Röhm were no longer theoretical. The army's patience was thinning, the propaganda machine was prepared. Germany stood on the edge of decision. And the next move would not be administrative, it would be irreversible. By the end of the first quarter of 1934, the confrontation between Adolf Hitler and Ernst Röhm was no longer a matter of personality or wounded pride. It was the collision of two incompatible visions of the future. One demanded perpetual upheaval, the other required controlled power. And in that collision, only one could survive. Röhm represented the revolutionary core of National Socialism, a current rooted in anti-capitalist rhetoric and resentment of the traditional elite. Many early party figures had spoken of land reform, wealth redistribution, and the dismantling of what they called bourgeois privilege. The SAS millions believed they had fought not only to destroy Marxism, but to transform Germany socially and economically. They expected rewards, they expected radical change. But Hitler's priorities had always run deeper and darker. Throughout the 1920s, at rallies and party conferences, he had denounced Marxism, Germany's mortal enemy. He rejected the idea of a planned economy. He insisted that private property, under loyal leadership, must remain intact. Once in power, he declared that revolution could not be permanent. It must stabilize into authority. Industry was not to be overthrown. It was to be harnessed. The traditional army was not to be replaced. It was to be strengthened. His worldview was not socialist. It was racial. Every policy decision flowed from that belief: diplomacy, economics, military planning. The Non-Aggression Pact with Poland was not an act of moderation, but of timing, a strategic pause to prevent encirclement. Economic management aimed not at equality, but at preparation. Centralization of the state was not bureaucratic efficiency. It was the elimination of obstacles to ideological execution. In this framework, the SA became a problem. A mass militia demanding social revolution threatened alliances with the Reichswehr and industrial elites, alliances essential for rearmament. A restless 4 million man force risked instability at a moment when Germany needed consolidation. The SAS radicalism was no longer useful, it was dangerous. And dangerous elements in Hitler's system of thought were to be removed. Meanwhile, under the steady direction of Heinrich Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich, the evidence against Röhm had been assembled into an organized case. Conversations, allegations, suspicions, each documented and cross-referenced. The SS, disciplined and ideologically rigid, stood ready to act. Unlike the SA, its loyalty was personal and absolute. The Reichswehr's leadership made its position unmistakable: order must prevail. President Paul von Hindenburg, aging and increasingly frail, represented the last constitutional authority above Hitler. His support and that of the army was indispensable. If Hitler failed to curb the SA, he risked losing that backing. If he acted, he would secure it. The choice was narrowing. By late March 1934, Germany stood balanced on a knife's edge. The state had been centralized, the press had been subdued. The legal system had been reshaped. Concentration camps operated within a new bureaucratic normal. The revolutionary fervor of 1933 had cooled into structured authority. But beneath that authority lay tension coiled like a spring. The SA demanded a second revolution, the army demanded discipline. Industrialists demanded predictability, the SS demanded opportunity. And Hitler, convinced of his historic mission and guided by an apocalyptic racial ideology, prepared to eliminate the final internal obstacle to absolute control. The illusion of stability had served its purpose, the diplomatic gestures had bought time. The legal transformations had cleared the field. Now consolidation would give way to action. The dictatorship was no longer forming, it was ready to strike.